The terrifying truth is that biological warfare is not a twisted invention of modern science or 20th century global conflicts. Do not let the movies fool you into thinking the medieval period was merely a time of noble knights, romantic chivalry, and majestic castles reaching toward the heavens. The reality of the 14th century was a spine-chilling era of survival against an unforgiving nature. If it were you standing on the cold, damp stone walls of the Crimean city of Kaffa in the autumn of 1346, you would not survive 24 hours. This is no fairy tale. This is hell on earth. You are about to witness the exact moment when the darkest nightmare in human history was unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. Imagine looking up at the sky, expecting the familiar sight of heavy stones being hurled by siege engines, only to see a rain of rotting, infected corpses crashing down into your streets. The air instantly became suffocating, thick with the foul-smelling stench of decomposing flesh and black blood. This was the birth of the Black Death as a weapon, a moment so brutal and bloody that it would soon tear apart the very fabric of European civilization. To understand this nightmare, we must journey to the edges of the known world, to the grand and imposing fortress of Kaffa, situated on the shores of the Black Sea. Kaffa was a crown jewel of the Genoese trading empire. It was a bustling, prosperous hub where the exotic goods of the Silk Road met the hungry markets of the West. Silks, spices, and precious metals flowed through its gates daily. The city was heavily fortified, surrounded by massive double walls that had successfully repelled numerous attacks. The merchants and citizens inside felt secure, confident that their wealth and their defensive architecture could withstand any external threat. But in 1343, a dispute between the Italian merchants and the local Muslim population sparked a massive conflict. This tension drew the attention of Jani Beg, the ruthless Khan of the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was a terrifying Mongol Khanate, an unstoppable military machine that had swept across the steppes, conquering everything in its path. Jani Beg brought his vast army to the walls of Kaffa. Determined to crush the arrogant Genoese and take control of the lucrative trade routes, the Mongols laid siege to the city, cutting off its landward supply lines and initiating a brutal campaign of attrition. For years, the standoff continued. The Genoese, supplied by their powerful navy from the sea, held their ground. The Mongol army, camped out on the open plains, grew frustrated and weary. It was a classic, grinding medieval siege, destined to be decided by starvation or a breach in the walls. But out in the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia, a silent, invisible killer had awakened. It was not a rival human army or a new type of siege weapon. It was the plague, Yersinia pestis, a lethal bacterium carried by fleas on the backs of marmots and rats, had begun to spread along the very trade routes the Mongols sought to control. The nightmare truly began when the invincible warriors of the Golden Horde suddenly started to collapse in their camps. There was no enemy attacking them, no arrows piercing their armor, yet they were falling by the hundreds. The initial symptoms were deceptive, starting with a sudden, intense fever and a deep, aching weakness. But within days, the true horror of the disease revealed itself. The soldiers began screaming in absolute agony as their bodies were tortured by the infection. Massive, agonizing swellings known as buboes erupted in their armpits, necks, and groin. These grotesque lumps grew to the size of apples or even small melons. They were hard as rocks, hot to the touch, and filled with a putrid mixture of black blood and foul-smelling pus. When the buboes eventually burst open, the pain was said to be beyond any human comprehension. The soldiers, men who had ruthlessly slaughtered thousands of enemies without hesitation, were now reduced to crying, whimpering shells, begging for death to finish them off and end their torment. The plague devoured the Mongol camp with a terrifying speed. It extinguished life after life, turning the once proud military encampment into a sprawling, chaotic dungeon of the dying and the dead. The air grew thick with the smell of death, and the moans of the afflicted echoed through the night. The commanders of the Golden Horde watched in helpless despair as their unstoppable army literally rotted away before their eyes. They were losing the siege not to the Genoese defenders, but to a microscopic demon they could not fight. Desperate, humiliated, and filled with a chilling, cold-blooded resolve, Khan Jani Beg made a decision that would alter the course of human history. If his army was going to die in the shadow of Kaffa's walls, He would ensure that the arrogant merchants inside those walls would join them in the darkness. He ordered his remaining healthy soldiers to gather the grotesque, decomposing bodies of their fallen comrades. They dragged the plague-ridden corpses to the massive trebuchets, the giant wooden machines designed to hurl heavy boulders to smash fortifications instead of rocks. They loaded the swinging arms of the trebuchets with the infected dead. With a heavy thud and a mechanical groan, the machines launched their macabre payloads high into the air. The rotting corpses soared over the high stone walls of Kaffa, raining down upon the homes, the markets, and the people below. The impact of the bodies hitting the ground was sickening, spreading infected fluids, shattered bones, and plague-carrying fleas across the city. The citizens of Kaffa were paralyzed with a desperate, suffocating panic. They had prepared for fire, for arrows, and for starvation. But they could never have prepared for this. The sky was literally falling, bringing a biological apocalypse straight into their enclosed, crowded sanctuary. The once vibrant streets were now painted with the horrific remnants of the Mongol dead, turning the city into an inescapable trap. The reign of the dead did not stop after the first horrific volley. Day and night, the massive wooden arms of the Mongol trebuchets swung through the air, hurling hundreds of infected corpses over the walls of Kaffa. The city transformed from a wealthy trading hub into an inescapable, putrid dungeon. You have to understand the sheer, claustrophobic terror of being trapped inside those high stone walls. There was nowhere to run. The Genoese merchants, once proud and arrogant in their fortified sanctuary, were now forced to live among the shattered, decomposing remains of their enemies. They desperately tried to dispose of the biological weapons, dragging the rotting bodies through the narrow streets and hurling them into the dark waters of the Black Sea. But their frantic efforts were entirely useless. The true enemy was not the dead flesh itself, but the microscopic demons hiding within it. Millions of infected fleas abandoned the cold, dead bodies of the Mongol soldiers and desperately sought living, warm blood. They found it in the panicked citizens of Kaffa. And more devastatingly, they found it in the massive population of black rats that infested the city. These rats, carrying the fleas, scurried into the grain silos, hid beneath the floorboards, and nested in the very beds of the terrified population. Within days, the biological time bomb detonated. The invisible killer began to tear through the city with an unstoppable, merciless fury. Do not let modern medicine make you underestimate the sheer brutality of this pathogen. This was not a simple fever. The Black Death was a three-headed monster that destroyed the human body in the most agonizing ways imaginable. First came the bubonic plague. The terrified citizens of Kaffa began to experience the exact same nightmare that had decimated the Mongol horde outside. Horde, fiercely painful swellings erupted in their groins and armpits. The skin stretched and turned a deep, bruised purple. The pain was so absolute, so mind-shattering, that victims would scream until their vocal cords tore. They would thrash in their beds, begging God for mercy. But no mercy came. When the buboes burst, the stench of the black, infected blood and rotting tissue was enough to make the survivors vomit uncontrollably. But the nightmare was only just beginning to evolve, as the infection raged in the cramped, unsanitary conditions of the besieged city. The bacteria mutated its method of attack, unleashing the second, even more terrifying form, the pneumonic plague. The disease moved from the lymph nodes directly into the lungs. Now, it no longer needed the rats or the fleas to spread. It weaponized the very air the people breathed. A single cough, a gasp of pain, or a frantic whisper was enough to shoot a microscopic cloud of bloody, infected droplets into the face of a loved one. The victims of the pneumonic plague did not even have the time to develop the painful buboes. They simply began coughing up bright red, frothy blood. They drowned in their own fluids, their lungs completely destroyed from the inside out. Suffocating to death in a matter of hours, the panic inside Kaffa reached a level of absolute, primal madness. The social order collapsed completely. The dead were piling up so fast that there was no one left to bury them. The streets became rivers of raw sewage, human waste, and decomposing bodies. The stench was so thick, so utterly overpowering, that people tried to hold posies of flowers or vinegar-soaked rags to their noses. A pathetic and useless defense against a microscopic slaughterhouse. The third and most lethal form of the disease, the septicemic plague, began to appear. This was a 100% guaranteed death sentence. The bacteria flooded directly into the bloodstream, multiplying at a terrifying speed. It caused the blood to clot uncontrollably, cutting off circulation to the extremities. The victim's fingers, toes, and noses would turn completely black, dying and rotting while the person was still breathing. It is from this horrifying symptom that history would eventually crown this catastrophe with its chilling name, the Black Death. People were literally decomposing while fully conscious. The sheer psychological torture of watching your own flesh rot away, knowing there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop it, is a horror beyond the grasp of modern imagination. In this absolute hell on earth, fathers abandoned their infected children, husbands locked their coughing wives inside their homes and ran away. Priests, terrified of catching the demonic sickness, refused to hear the final confessions of the dying, leaving souls to face eternity without the comfort of their faith. The wealth of Kaffa meant nothing. Mountains of gold coins and fine silk could not buy a single breath of clean air or a moment of relief from the agonizing pain. The city was a graveyard for the living, a dark, suffocating pit of despair where the only certainty was a violent, bloody end. But human survival instinct is a powerful, desperate force. As the Mongol army outside finally began to break camp and retreat, utterly decimated by the same plague they had weaponized, a handful of surviving Genoese merchants saw a microscopic window of opportunity. The sea route was open. In a frantic, chaotic scramble, the desperate survivors fought their way to the harbor. They trampled over the dead and the dying, ignoring the pleading screams of their fellow citizens. They boarded 12 galleys, the fastest ships in their fleet, and frantically raised the sails. They believed they were escaping the apocalypse. They believed they were sailing towards safety, towards the familiar, comforting shores of Italy. But the horrifying truth was that they were not refugees fleeing a disaster. They were the vectors. They were the executioners of Europe. They had brought the nightmare aboard with them, hidden in their clothes, in the fur of the rats in the cargo hold, and pumping quietly in their own infected veins. The journey of those 12 Genoese galleys across the Black Sea and through the narrow straits of the Bosporus is one of the most chilling voyages in human history. They were not ships of salvation. They were floating coffins. As the shores of the Crimea faded into the distance, the terrified survivors on board likely breathed a collective sigh of relief. But their relief was a cruel, short-lived illusion. The claustrophobic, dark, and damp conditions of a medieval galley were the absolute perfect breeding ground for Yersinia pestis. Below the decks, in the cramped, airless cargo holds, the infected rats multiplied and the fleas feasted. It did not take long for the invisible monster to strike again. In the middle of the open sea, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, the biological time bomb exploded for the second time. Imagine the sheer, suffocating terror of being trapped on a wooden ship, surrounded by thousands of miles of deep water. While an unstoppable killer silently moves from sailor to sailor, the agonizing symptoms began to manifest. The sudden, bone-crushing fevers, the grotesque, purple-black buboes swelling in the groins of the oarsmen, the sickening sound of wet, bloody coughs echoing through the lower decks. The ship's surgeons, armed with nothing but useless ancient texts and a terrifying lack of understanding, were completely powerless. They tried bleeding the patients, slicing open their veins to let the bad blood out. But this only weakened the dying men faster and spread the infected blood across the slippery wooden decks. The once disciplined crews descended into absolute chaos and primal fear. Men who had survived brutal naval battles were now crying like children, clutching their swollen, rotting flesh in the dark. The death toll was catastrophic. Bodies were unceremoniously dumped over the sides of the ships, sinking into the cold depths of the sea, leaving a macabre trail of corpses all the way from the Mediterranean to the shores of Sicily. Some of the ships became entirely crewless, ghost ships drifting aimlessly on the currents, their decks littered with the blackened skeletons of those who had thought they had escaped the nightmare of Kaffa. But a few of the galleys, driven by the desperate, fading strength of the remaining healthy sailors, continued their relentless push towards the west. They passed through the Aegean Sea, bringing the infection to the bustling ports of Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire. The bridge between East and West was completely unprepared for the biological onslaught. The plague swept through the magnificent city like a scythe, cutting down the emperor's family and the poorest beggars in the streets with equal, terrifying indifference. The disease did not care about wealth, status, or holy titles. It only cared about warm flesh and flowing blood. By October of 1347, the surviving Genoese galleys finally approached their destination, the vibrant, wealthy port city of Messina in Sicily. The citizens of Messina, completely ignorant of the apocalyptic horror that was sailing toward them, gathered at the docks. They looked out at the horizon, expecting the familiar sight of returning merchants bringing exotic spices, beautiful silks, and tales of distant lands. But as the ship slowly drifted into the harbor, the joyous anticipation quickly turned into a cold, creeping dread. The galleys were eerily silent. The sails were torn. The rigging was tangled, and the few figures moving on the decks looked like walking corpses. When the port authorities finally boarded the vessels, the stench of death and putrefaction hit them like a physical blow. The scene below decks was a vision pulled straight from the deepest, darkest pits of hell. Rotting bodies were stacked in the corners. The few surviving sailors were delirious with fever, their skin covered in foul, leaking sores, their eyes wide with a trauma so profound it could never be spoken. The officials of Messina, horrified by what they saw, immediately realized the catastrophic danger. They ordered the galleys to leave the port immediately. They threatened to burn the ships to the waterline if they did not turn around. But their reaction, driven by raw panic, was already too late. The ropes had been tied to the docks. The gangplanks had been lowered for just a few fatal minutes. In that brief window of time, the true passengers of the death ships disembarked. The infected rats, seeking fresh food and new hiding places, scurried down the ropes and into the bustling streets of Messina. The fleas, carrying the deadly payload of Yersinia pestis in their guts, leaped onto the clothes of the dockworkers, the customs officials, and the curious onlookers. The biological weapon that had been forged in the steppes of Central Asia and weaponized outside the walls of Kaffa had successfully breached the fortress of Europe. The continent was completely defenseless. The people of the 14th century had no microscopes, no antibiotics, and absolutely no concept of germ theory. They believed in bad air, divine punishment, and astrological alignments. They were about to face a scientific reality so brutal and unforgiving that it would shatter their faith in God and tear their society apart piece by bloody piece. Within days of the ghost ships arriving, the people of Messina began to feel the heavy, aching fatigue. Then came the fever, and then the terrifying, agonizing black swellings. The nightmare had arrived, and it was hungry. Do not think for a single second that the kings, the nobility, or the holy men in their golden palaces had any plan to save you. When the Black Death broke out of Messina and began to crawl across the Italian peninsula, it moved with a terrifying, unstoppable speed. It devoured towns, village, and massive cities alike. Imagine waking up in a bustling city like Florence in the spring of 1348. Within weeks, the streets were completely emptied of the living and choked with the dead. The nightmare was so absolute that the very fabric of human empathy was completely torn apart. The famous writer Giovanni Boccaccio lived through this hell, and his accounts are bone-chilling. He wrote that the terror was so profound that brothers abandoned brothers, uncles abandoned nephews, and most unnatural of all, mothers and fathers refused to nurse or even look at their own infected children. They left their own flesh and blood to scream in the dark, suffocating alone in their own filth. The social order did not just bend. It completely shattered. The people who held the real power in these doomed cities were no longer the rich merchants or the noble lords. The new masters of the apocalypse were the corpse clearers. These were often ruthless criminals, the lowest scums of society, who were paid exorbitant amounts of money to drag the rotting bodies out of the houses. If you were still alive but too weak to fight, these ruthless men would sometimes just throw you onto the carts with the dead, burying you alive in massive, overflowing trenches just to get the job done faster. The bodies were stacked in layers, separated only by thin sheets of dirt. And where was the church during this blood-soaked nightmare? In the 14th century, the church was the absolute center of the universe. The people believed that the Pope and the priests were their direct line to God. But the disease did not spare the holy men. In fact, because the good priests actually visited the sick, they were slaughtered by the infection in massive numbers. The Pope himself locked himself inside his private chambers in Avignon. He sat between two massive, roaring fires, day and night. In a desperate attempt to purify the air, it ironically saved him by driving away the fleas. but it left his flock completely abandoned, with the doctors prescribing useless remedies like drinking crushed emeralds, bathing in human urine, or bleeding the patient until they passed out. The desperate masses turned to extreme religious fanaticism. They believed this was the ultimate punishment from a wrathful God for the sins of humanity. From this absolute despair emerged the terrifying spectacle of the flagellants. Imagine standing on a dirt road and hearing the eerie, mournful chanting before you see them. A procession of hundreds of men, stripped to the waist, marching slowly into your town. In their hands, they held heavy leather whips tipped with sharp iron spikes. With every step, they swung the whips over their shoulders, tearing into their own flesh. They beat themselves until their backs were a horrific mess of raw muscle and dark blood, hoping that their physical torture would satisfy God and stop the plague. But the devastating truth is that these zealots were just mobile biological weapons. As they traveled from town to town, their open wounds, their infected blood, and the fleas hiding in their dirty robes brought the death sentence to previously untouched villages. They thought they were the saviors, but they were the executioners, dragging the nightmare deeper into the heart of Europe. It is a chilling, mind-blowing reality that just a few swings of a Mongol wooden trebuchet outside an isolated trading port ignited a biological fire that literally burned down a third of the known world. Do not underestimate the sheer macro-butterfly effect of this blood-soaked event. The Black Death did not just kill individuals, it completely slaughtered the medieval way of life. By the time the nightmare finally began to recede in the early 1350s, the European continent was a vast, silent graveyard. It is estimated that up to 50 million people had their lives brutally snuffed out. Entire family lines were erased from existence. Thousands of bustling villages were transformed into empty, rotting ghost towns where the only sound was the howling wind blowing through the abandoned houses. The stench of mass graves lingered in the soil for generations. But from this unimaginable dark reality, the entirely different world was forcefully born out of the ashes and the decay. You see, the sudden, violent death of so many millions of people created a massive, unprecedented crisis for the rich nobility. The feudal lords who had ruled with absolute, iron-fisted power suddenly found themselves with vast, empty fields of rotting crops and absolutely no peasants left to harvest them. The surviving laborers, the desperate men and women who had watched their families die in absolute agony, suddenly realized something incredibly powerful. Their labor was now desperately needed. For the first time in human history, the poorest people at the absolute bottom of the food chain had the leverage to demand higher wages, better living conditions, and actual freedom from their aristocratic masters. When the lords inevitably tried to violently force the peasants back into their miserable, enslaved roles, the survivors exploded into brutal, bloody rebellions across Europe. They burned down the manors and slaughtered the tax collectors. The terrified nobility, weakened and completely outnumbered, could not hold back the tide. The heavy iron chains of the feudal system were permanently shattered, not by a brilliant political revolution or a heroic knight in shining armor, but by the relentless, microscopic jaws of the infected fleas that had hitched a ride from the steppes of Asia. The absolute power of the Catholic Church was also permanently fractured. The surviving population had watched their desperate prayers go completely unanswered as the bodies piled up in the streets and the sewers overflowed with the dead. They had seen the supposedly holy priests die just as quickly and just as painfully as the worst criminals and sinners. This massive, collective psychological trauma planted the deep, dark seeds of doubt that would eventually explode into the Reformation, completely reshaping the modern religious and political world. The legacy of the Black Death is a terrifying, cold-blooded reminder that human civilization is incredibly fragile. No matter how powerful our empires become, or how thick we build our towering stone fortress walls, we are always just one microscopic mutation away from an absolute, biological apocalypse. The nightmare of Kaffa proves that the most devastating weapons in human history are not made of iron and gunpowder, but of flesh, blood, and invisible disease. Thank you for surviving this journey into the darkest chapter of human history. If you are fascinated by the brutal, uncensored reality that the movies tried to bury, do not forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below telling us what you would have done if you were trapped inside the suffocating walls of Kaffa on that fateful day. But the horror of the plague did not end with the 14th century. In our next video, we will peel back the terrifying, Historical truth behind the most iconic and nightmare-inducing symbol of this dark era. We are going to look behind the terrifying, emotionless bird-like mask of the plague doctors. Were they truly brave medical saviors trying to cure the sick? Or were they just greedy? Blood-soaked executioners profiting from the endless sea of rotting corpses. Make sure your notifications are turned on, because you will not want to miss the shocking, blood-curdling truth.